My name is Arthur, and I'm 67 years old. I told the woman I was about to marry that I was just the foreman on the ranch where we lived. I never told her I owned it, along with 240 acres of prime Tennessee horse country and a second property over in Shelbyville. I'm glad I kept that to myself, because exactly 3 days after she moved her things into my home, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table and handed me a document asking me to sign over half the property to her name. She said it was just paperwork. She said it was what married couples do. I've been working with horses since I was 19 years old. Started as a stable hand outside of Nashville, shoveling stalls and learning which end of a horse bites. 48 years later, I own Blue Creek Ranch, a working equestrian property with 12 boarding stalls, a training ring, and more memories built into its soil than I could count in a lifetime. My wife Carol and I built it together. She passed 3 years ago from a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning in April. No illness leading up to it, no chance to say everything I should have said. Just there one morning and gone by afternoon. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be honest about that. My daughter Claire had been nudging me for 2 years to get out of the house, go to church socials, join something. I mostly ignored her. Then my neighbor Joe dragged me to a charity auction benefiting the local equestrian center, and that's where I met Diane. She was 59, sharp-eyed, and she knew her way around a horse. That was the first thing that got my attention. Most people at those events were there for the wine. She was standing by the paddock fence, asking one of the handlers about the gait of a chestnut mare, and the questions she was asking were good ones. We started talking. 2 hours passed, like 20 minutes. She told me she was a widow. Her husband had died 4 years ago from a heart attack. She'd been living in Murfreesboro, working part-time as an event planner for a local venue. She had a son named Kyle, she said, 20 years old, finishing up at community college, a good kid going through a rough patch. She talked about him the way a tired mother talks, with love worn down around the edges by worry. Before we leave the auction that night, I want to ask everyone watching, please tell me in the comments what city and state you're listening from. I read every single one. I told Diane I managed the ranch out on Blue Creek Road. I said I'd been there 15 years. That part was true enough. I just left out the deed with my name on it. After Carol passed, a woman I dated briefly changed the moment she found out what the property was worth. The conversations shifted. Suddenly, everything was about what we could do with the land, how much we could sell the boarding operation for, whether I'd ever considered subdividing the back acreage. I ended things after 6 weeks. The experience left a residue I couldn't quite wash off. So when I met Diane, I made a decision. I'd just be Arthur the foreman, a man with a steady job, a modest paycheck, a simple life. If she liked that Arthur, then maybe I'd found something real. She did seem to like that Arthur. We dated for 7 months. She drove out to the ranch on weekends. She helped me feed in the mornings, never complained about the smell, never checked her phone when we were talking. Her son Kyle came around twice. Quiet young man, maybe a little sullen, but I figured that was college-age indifference. He shook my hand both times, looked me in the eye, seemed fine. My daughter Claire was less convinced. She met Diane at a Sunday dinner and was polite throughout, but on the drive home she called me and said, "Dad, I like her. I just feel like I don't really know her yet." I told her that was fair. I said I was taking my time. I proposed in November, sitting on the back porch watching the sun drop behind the ridge. Diane cried. Real tears, I thought. She said she'd been afraid to hope for something like this again. She said yes before I finished the sentence. We planned a small ceremony for February, just family and a handful of friends, My ranch hand Marcus, who'd worked with me for 11 years, stood up beside me. Claire came down from Knoxville with her husband and their 2 kids. Diane's sister Roberta flew in from Phoenix. Kyle wore a new suit and sat in the front row. The ceremony was held in the barn, which sounds rough, but wasn't. We'd done weddings there before for boarding clients and knew how to make it right. Candles, flowers, a string quartet. Carol would have rolled her eyes and loved every bit of it. We said our vows. I meant every word of mine. I believe Diane meant hers too, right up until the moment she stopped needing to. That night we stayed in the main house, in the bedroom I'd shared with Carol for 22 years. I'd repainted it the previous spring, put in new furniture. It felt like mine again in a quiet way. Diane looked around the room when we came upstairs and I saw something cross her face. I told myself it was nothing. The first morning after the wedding I woke early the way I always do. Horses don't keep bankers' hours. I went downstairs to start the coffee and found the kitchen light already on. Diane was sitting at the table. Kyle was sitting across from her. A pile of papers was spread between them. Kyle was supposed to have gone back to Murfreesboro the night before. Morning, I said. I didn't let on that anything felt strange. You're up early. Diane looked up and her face was composed in a way that felt rehearsed. Arthur, come sit down. We need to talk about some things. I poured my coffee and sat. She said that, now that we were married, she'd been thinking seriously about our situation. The word "our" landed oddly. She said the foreman's salary I was earning wasn't going to be enough for the kind of stability she needed, that she'd given up her apartment, her independence, made a real sacrifice to come here and be part of this life. I said, Diane, I thought we talked about finances before we got married. We talked about the basics, she said. But I've been doing some thinking, and Kyle has been helping me look into some things. She nodded toward him. He had a laptop open and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting. Kyle said, without looking up, that a ranch foreman in Tennessee typically makes between $40,000 and $55,000 a year. He said that wasn't a realistic income for supporting a household of 3, especially if she was going to reduce her work hours. 3, I said. Kyle, are you planning to live here? He looked up then. Mom and I discussed it. I'm taking a semester off. I'll be around to help out. Something cold moved through me. Help out with what, exactly? He didn't know a thing about horses. I'd watched him step back from a calm gelding in the paddock like it was going to eat him. Diane folded her hands on the table. Arthur, I think the best solution is to talk to the ranch owners about our living situation. We need a larger arrangement. The foreman's cottage is fine for one person, but we're a family now. I'd like to speak with whoever owns this property about formalizing a better housing arrangement as part of your employment package. And frankly, I think you should be asking for a raise. You've given this place 15 years. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said I'd look into it, that I'd need to talk to some people. She smiled. Good. And Arthur. She slid one of the papers toward me. Kyle found this template online. It's a spousal property agreement. Since you've been here so long and you're so tied up in this property, I think it makes sense for both of us to have something formalized, just so we're protected, both of us. The document was asking for joint tenancy rights on the property where we resided. She didn't know the property where we resided was mine. I picked up the paper, looked at it long enough to seem like I was reading it, and set it back down. I said, I'll need to talk to a lawyer before I sign anything. Diane's expression stayed pleasant, but something behind her eyes tightened. Kyle said, it's pretty standard stuff, Arthur. I said, I'm sure it is, and I'm sure a lawyer will tell me that. I stood up. I've got the morning feeding to handle. Out in the barn, I found Marcus already there, filling hay nets. He took one look at me and said, "You don't look like a man who just got married yesterday." I told him what had just happened. He listened without interrupting, which is Marcus's way. When I finished, he said, "I figured something like this was coming." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, then said that Kyle had come out to the barn alone the evening before the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner when most people were inside. He said Kyle had asked Marcus some specific questions about the ranch's revenue, about whether the owner ever came around, about what Marcus knew about the deed. I stared at him. Marcus said he'd told Kyle he was just the help and didn't know anything about that kind of thing, but it bothered him enough that he'd almost said something to me last night and hadn't. He apologized. I told him not to apologize. I asked him to call my daughter Claire. I went to my office in the back of the barn, the one Diane had never seen because I'd never had reason to show it to her. It had my name on a filing cabinet and a framed copy of the original deed on the wall beside a photo of Carol on our first horse. I called Claire myself. She answered on the second ring. When I told her what had happened, she didn't say "I told you so." She just said, "Dad, listen to me. I need you to search Diane Mercer, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, right now." I typed while she waited. The first results were ordinary. A Facebook page, a LinkedIn, then further down a local news story from 2 years back. Woman named Diane Mercer, named in a civil lawsuit filed by a retired electrician in Smyrna, who claimed she had pressured him to add her to the title of his home within weeks of their relationship becoming serious. The case had been settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement. The man's name was redacted. Claire said, "I found that last week, Dad. I didn't show you because I didn't have anything solid and I was scared of being wrong and ruining your wedding day. I told her she should have shown me. She said, 'I know. I'm sorry. But Dad,'" her voice shifted, "there's something else." I hired someone to look into her. A woman I know through work who does background investigations. I got her results yesterday afternoon and I didn't know what to do with them. What did they say? She took a breath. Kyle Mercier is not 20 years old. He's 31. He doesn't go to community college. He has a record in 2 counties for fraud-related offenses, the most recent being 3 years ago, charges that were eventually dropped. Diane's sister, Roberta, isn't actually her sister. Her real name is Paula Thorne, and she's a woman Diane has worked with before in similar situations. The background investigator found 2 other men in the past 4 years who matched the same profile, older widowers with property, met through charity events or community gatherings. One signed over rights to a vehicle and a piece of land in Williamson County before he realized what was happening. The other moved away from the area entirely. I sat in my office for a long time after we hung up. The morning light was coming through the small window and landing on Carol's picture. I thought about her for a moment. What she would have thought, what she would have done. She would have been calm. Carol was always the calmest person in any storm. I called my attorney, a man named Franklin, who'd handled the ranch's legal matters for 12 years. I told him everything. He listened, then said, "Arthur, what do you want to do here?" "I want to know how far they're willing to go." Franklin was quiet. "That's a risk." "I know. But if I walk in there now and tell her I'm the owner and the marriage is over, she calls a lawyer and we spend 6 months in court. I need them to reveal themselves clearly enough that there's no room for interpretation." He said he understood. He asked what I had in mind. I spent the rest of that day playing along. Diane asked again about the spousal agreement at dinner. I told her I'd spoken to the ranch manager, that he'd confirmed they'd be willing to discuss an upgraded housing arrangement for long-term employees and their families. that I'd set up a meeting for later in the week with someone from the ownership side. She smiled warmly and reached across the table and touched my hand. "That's wonderful, Arthur. I knew you'd come around." Kyle said nothing, but I saw him glance at Diane with what I can only describe as professional satisfaction. That night I called Marcus and laid out what I needed from him. He agreed to everything without hesitation. Then I called Claire and told her to come down from Knoxville. She said, "Dad, do you want me there for emotional support or logistical support?" "Both," I said. She said she'd be there by Thursday morning. The meeting was set for Friday afternoon. I told Diane that the ownership representative would meet with both of us in the main house sitting room at 2 o'clock to discuss the housing arrangement and my employment terms going forward. I told her Kyle was welcome to attend since he'd been so involved in the planning. She said, "Of course. I want us to be transparent." The word transparent, coming from her, was something. Thursday night, Claire sat with me in the kitchen after Diane and Kyle had gone to bed. She had a folder of documents in front of her and dark circles under her eyes from the drive. "Dad," she said, "you understand that what you're about to do is risky. They might get hostile." "I know. Kyle has a history of physical intimidation. The report mentioned it. I know that too. Marcus will be in the room," I said. "And I've spoken to the county sheriff's department. A deputy I've known for 20 years is going to be in the barn. I'll have a reason to step out and get him if things escalate." Claire nodded slowly. She looked at me the way children look at their parents when they're not sure whether to be proud or terrified. She said, "Mom would have hated this." I said, "Mom would have had it wrapped up by Tuesday." Claire laughed, which was the first time I'd heard her laugh since she arrived. She reached over and put her hand over mine. Friday at 2 o'clock, I was sitting in the sitting room when Diane and Kyle came in. Marcus entered behind them and closed the door. He was in a collared shirt, which for Marcus was as formal as it got. Diane looked at him and then at me with a trace of confusion. "Is the ranch manager coming?" Marcus sat down. He said, "I'm the one who handles operational logistics on behalf of the property. I've been authorized to discuss the employment and housing arrangements you requested." Diane settled into her chair. Kyle sat beside her with his legal pad. "Good," she said. "Then let's be efficient about this. My husband has given 15 years of his life to this property. We feel that warrants a more substantial arrangement than what he's currently receiving. We'd like to discuss a formal, long-term housing agreement that cannot be terminated if his employment ends. A guaranteed residence in writing." Marcus said, "I understand. The ownership has reviewed the request. However, there are some complications we need to address first." "What kind of complications?" Marcus looked at his notes. "The foreman's housing, as it currently stands, is employment contingent. If employment ends, for any reason, the housing arrangement ends within 30 days. That's been the standing policy." Diane's expression didn't change. "Then we'd like the policy changed. That would require approval from the owner directly." "That's above my authority." "Then get them on the phone," Kyle said. Marcus said, "The owner is unavailable today. That's why you're meeting with me." Kyle leaned forward. "Look, my mother is Arthur's wife. She has legal standing in this residence. You can't just tell her she'll be kicked out if something happens to his job." "No one said anything about kicking anyone out," Marcus said. "You implied it." Kyle's voice had an edge now. Same edge I'd heard when he told me his mother owned me. "You're implying that her security here is dependent on Arthur staying employed. That's not acceptable." "What is acceptable," Marcus asked in a tone of practiced calm, "is discussing what legal arrangements exist and what modifications the ownership might be willing to consider. That's what this meeting is for. The modification we want, Diane said, is a property interest. She slid the spousal agreement document across the coffee table toward Marcus. We want Arthur's name added to the deed, and given that we're married, I want my name added as well. That protects everyone. Marcus looked at the document without touching it, Diane said. It protects the ranch's investment in a long-term employee. It shows good faith. And frankly, if the ownership declines, we'll have to consider whether Arthur's 15 years here have been treated fairly under Tennessee employment law. That's a creative reading of employment law, Marcus said. Kyle stood up. You know what? Forget this. He looked at me directly for the first time since sitting down. Arthur, I've been patient. My mother has been patient. My mother has been patient. But this dance is over. You've got assets tied up in this ranch from 15 years of work. You deserve something concrete. Either you go to bat for your wife and get her name on something of value, or we're going to have to start asking harder questions about what you've actually built here and who has the right to claim it. What kind of harder questions? I asked. Kyle moved toward me. He stopped about 4 feet away and lowered his voice. The kind that get lawyers involved. The kind that get messy and public. You're 67 years old, Arthur. You want to spend the next 2 years in court fighting over what you're entitled to? Or do you want to make a smart decision right now? Is that a threat? I asked. I said it clearly, the same way I'd said it in my mind all week. Kyle smiled. Take it how you want, old man. Diane said nothing. Her eyes were watching me with flat calculation. I stood up. I said, let me show you something. I walked to the bookshelf on the east wall and took down the framed copy of the property deed. I carried it over and set it on the coffee table in front of Diane. I set it so she could read the name on it without picking it up. I've owned this ranch for 22 years, I said. My wife Carol and I bought it in 2003 with everything we had saved. Marcus has been my employee for 11 years, not a representative of some absent owner. There is no ownership above me. There is no management to appeal to. This is my home, my land, and my business. The room went very quiet. Diane looked at the deed, then at me, then at the deed again. I continued. I didn't tell you that because the last woman I dated changed entirely when she found out what I had. I wanted to know who you were without the money in the room, and now I do. Kyle moved fast. He grabbed my arm and got in close. You lied to her. You lied to my mother for 7 months. That's fraud. That spot. A door opened. Claire walked in from the hallway. Behind her came Deputy Ray Stanhope in uniform with his hand resting on his belt. Kyle let go of my arm and stepped back. Ray looked around the room with the unhurried patience of a man who'd seen most varieties of human foolishness. He said, Afternoon. I understand there may be some concerns here that need to be addressed. Diane stood. She straightened her blouse. Her voice was still composed. There's been a misunderstanding here. My husband concealed material information from me prior to our marriage. I have legal grounds. Ray said, Ma'am, I've already reviewed the report filed by the background investigator and spoken with the attorney, Mr. Franklin Davis, this morning. I'm going to need to ask you and your son to come with me. He's not her son, Claire said. She said it quietly, not triumphantly. Just a fact being put into the room. Diane looked at her then. Something behind her eyes shifted. They didn't come quietly, but they came. Kyle argued until he was red-faced in the driveway and had to be reminded twice that he was within a step of making his situation significantly worse. Diane walked to the patrol car with a stillness that I found more chilling than Kyle's outburst. She didn't look back at the house. In the weeks that followed, Franklin worked with me on the annulment. Tennessee's grounds for annulment include fraud in the inducement, and what Diane had done cleared that bar considerably. The civil fraud case was filed shortly after. The two previous victims were located and both agreed to cooperate. The man from Williamson County, a retired school teacher named Gerald, called me one evening. He was quiet on the phone and sounded like a man who'd been ashamed of something for a long time. He said, "I want you to know I would have spoken up sooner if I hadn't felt like such a fool." I told him I understood that feeling completely. I told him there was nothing to be ashamed of, that these people were professionals and that being targeted by a professional isn't a character failure. He said, "You know what gets me? I genuinely thought she cared about me." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I think that's what makes it so hard. The caring doesn't come from nowhere. You're not imagining it. They're just using it as a tool." Gerald said, "Yeah, that's exactly what it is." Kyle was charged with criminal intimidation and conspiracy. Diane faced 2 counts of attempted fraud and 1 count of theft by deception related to the Williamson County case, where Gerald had in fact transferred a vehicle title to her before catching on. Paula Thorne, who'd come down from Phoenix, playing the role of supportive sister, was named as a co-conspirator. I won't pretend the trial was easy to sit through. Listening to how deliberate all of it had been, the charity event circuit, the research into widowers with real property, the way they'd calibrated how quickly to move based on the mark's level of loneliness. It wasn't easy to hear and not take personally. My attorney told me not to take it personally. I told him that was like telling someone not to notice they'd been standing in the rain. He said, "Fair point. But you're dry now." Claire stayed at the ranch for 2 weeks after the arrests. She rode with me in the mornings, which she hadn't done since she was a teenager. On a Thursday morning, we were walking the fence line on the east pasture, and she said, "Dad, can I ask you something without you getting your back up?" I said, "You can try." She said, "Do you think you'll want to try again someday? With someone?" I thought about that for a long time. Long enough that a horse at the far end of the pasture got bored watching us and walked away. I said, "Maybe. But I think if I do, I won't start with a lie, even a well-intentioned one. I think the right way to find out who someone is to be honest about who you are and see if they stay." Claire said, "Mom used to say that. I didn't know that." She did. She said it all the time. We finished the fence line and headed back. The morning was cold and clean, the way Tennessee mornings are in early March, and the horses were moving in the field, and the barn was there at the end of the property, the way it had been for 22 years. At the sentencing, Diane received 4 years. Kyle received 3 for the intimidation charges and his priors. Paula received 18 months in probation. There was no remorse from any of them in the courtroom. Diane looked at me once just before the judge read her sentence, and I couldn't tell what was in her face. I'd spent 7 months thinking I could read her face. I decided I probably never could. Gerald came up to me outside the courthouse afterward. He shook my hand and held it for a moment. He said, "What you did took guts." I said, "It took 11 years of Marcus and the right daughter." He smiled at that. That evening I sat on the porch as the sun went down behind the ridge, and I thought about Carol. I thought about the 22 years we'd spent building something real, and how the fact that someone had tried to steal it and failed didn't diminish it. The land was still there. The horses were still there. The deed still had my name on it, and hers too, in the original filing, the way it always would. I thought about what Gerald had said. I genuinely thought she cared about me. I understood that. I thought so too. The ache of that doesn't disappear just because you were right to be suspicious. The loneliness that made me want to believe her was real. even if she wasn't. Marcus knocked on the porch door frame at dusk and asked if I needed anything. I said no. He nodded and went back to lock up the barn the way he did every night. I poured a glass of whiskey and raised it to nobody in particular. To Carol, I said, and to the truth. My phone buzzed. It was Claire. "Hey, sweetheart," she said. "Tom and I want to bring the kids up this summer. Spend a week. Let them get on the horses." I said I'd like that very much. She said, "And Dad, maybe when we're up there, you can show the kids the back 40. I don't think they've ever seen the whole property." I smiled. I said I thought that was a fine idea. After we hung up, I sat there until the stars came out over the ridge. Tomorrow, I'd be back to the work of running the ranch, the ordinary and good work of a life that was mine. But tonight, I let myself just sit with the gratitude of it. Gratitude for Marcus, for Claire, for Franklin and Ray, and for the truth that had been in that filing cabinet all along, patient as land always is. If you're out there watching this, and you're widowed, or you're lonely, or you've met someone who makes you feel like the warmth has come back into the room, I'm not here to scare you. Real love exists. I had it for 22 years, and I know what it feels like. What I want you to take from this is simple. Your instincts are not overreacting. When something feels rehearsed, it probably is. When someone moves faster than the feeling warrants, slow down. And when someone shows you who they are by what they ask for, believe them the first time. Your worth is not your land or your savings or your years of work, but those things belong to you, and you don't owe them to anyone who hasn't earned your trust. Protect your boundaries. Trust the people who knew you before you had anything to prove. And remember that the right person, when they come, won't need a document to feel secure. They'll just need you. Thank you for being here with me today. I'm Arthur, and this is Voices of Uncle Leonard. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from. I read every single one.